China, again, denying it is in negotiations with the United States to resolve the ongoing trade war as members of the Trump administration insist the U.S. is better positioned to win that economic battle after President Trump imposed a massive 145% tariff on imports from China.
And that standoff now hitting closer and closer to home. Gene Seroka, the executive director of the Port of Los Angeles, the #1 container port in the Western Hemisphere, warns that difficult decisions are ahead as the port could see a 35% decrease in arriving cargo should the trade war continue.
Gene Seroka, executive director of the Port of LA, is here with us in studio. Gene, thank you for being with us tonight. Liberation Day, of course, was April 2nd. When you talk about the global supply chain, nothing is instant. There's a lag. So here we are about a month out. Where do things stand, and what are these difficult decisions that you foresee in the weeks ahead?
Micah, we're starting to see the imports lighten up. In fact, by next week, as Cher just reported, we'll be down by about 35% year over year. Effectively, imports from China have been shut down because the cost is now 2.5 times more than it was for a product just last month.
So how does the president's 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs impacting orders and shipments and traffic?
While a little bit of a breather, Cher, it's not a long runway in our industry.
Yeah.
Typically, importers here in the U.S. put their orders into factories in Asia about 3 to 4 months ahead of a ship even leaving coming our way. So that's not going to change a lot of behavior. And still, it's 10% more than it was last month with those 75 or so countries, especially those in Southeast Asia. We talk a lot about China, which is on everybody's mind now, but it's countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, which also trade a lot with us.
Well, let's put this into some context that folks at home and all of us really can relate to. How does this outlook compare to the peak of the situation during COVID?
Different, but you could see some similarities. One, we're going to see a steep drop, Micah, in the arrivals that are coming in. That's going to mean that suddenly our truck drivers aren't hauling as many containers. Our dock workers aren't getting overtime or even turning to. They'll probably work less than a 40-hour work week. Along with those in the supply chain, even manufacturers aren't going to be shipping out as much. And that's where it's really hit us in California. The retaliatory tariffs are really socking the American farmer and those here in the Central Valley of California.
We'll touch on the domino effect and the ripple effect of all of this in a moment, but nothing really is a done deal. And, you know, as the head of the biggest container port in the Western Hemisphere, what is the solution here? How do you foresee us getting out of this?
Well, it's early days, but we have seen a little bit of a crack in the door. Tim Cook of Apple went to Washington, and then suddenly we got a little bit of a reprieve on electronics.
Yeah.
2 major retail CEOs were in Washington last week to talk about the importance of their business. And just today we got word that we might see some loosening on the automotive sector. So it seems to be building coalitions, talking to the administration about the impacts on the ground, could be a way to start seeing a little bit clearly about how we can have some segments here that can thrive.
So what kind of urgency is there or should there be for consumers when it relates to big ticket items? You mentioned the electronics, the furniture, apparels.
Well, this is where it's going to get interesting. Retailers, Micah, are telling me that they've got about 5 to 7 weeks of inventory remaining at normal levels. Now, that doesn't mean everything's going to go kaput, but if you're out there looking for a blue shirt, you might see 15 purple ones and maybe only 1 blue. So selection is going to start to narrow, and all indications are that prices will rise. These tariff costs, whether they be the 10% or the big ones from China, are going to be passed on to us as consumers.
Yeah, they're not going to take it themselves. They're going to pass it on to us. Now, last year, the Port of LA handled some $333 billion in cargo. Of that, $120 billion was from China. So I think the question here is, who needs who more? Do we need them more, or do they need us more?
I'd say the interdependencies are almost equal. China is America's factory, And our buying capability, 70% of our GDP is made up of consumer buying. I worked in China for about 4.5 years, still maintain great relationships there. And folks know that they need each other at the business level. Getting to this policy area, and especially in talks that have started off with a real thud across the international supply chain, need to be put back on level setting. There's no way that we can afford to have the deals that we do today at the retail level. We love to buy, whether it's going to the store or online curbside pickup. The prices that we buy at are because of all the efficiencies that have been created in the manufacturing process overseas.
If we see these declines, talk about the ripple effects, not just at the port. You're talking truckers, you're talking store shelves.
Yeah, that's right. And then suddenly we're going to see a little bit different look at what the consumer actually does. A lot of families are starting to tighten the purse strings a little bit. We know these tariffs are going to hit us right in the wallet. Does that change the direction a little bit of this U.S. economy, given we depend so much on that buying pattern of the U.S. consumer?
So you speak to a lot of retailers out there. You also have good relationships with people abroad as well, as you've mentioned. But when they're concerned, the retailers, what kind of inventory do we have here, and how long can they ride this out?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting and a little bit nuanced. The big box retailers that we all know and shop at did a pretty fair job of bringing inventory in early because they knew this day was possibly coming. That comes at a cost of additional money to spend on that, and as well as putting it in warehouses. But we have about 125,000 companies that import through the Port of Los Angeles on an annual basis. Most are small to mid-sized folks that couldn't necessarily do what the big guys did. They didn't bring in a lot of extra stuff, store it at a lower price to be prepared for this day. They're now grappling with, do I buy at these higher prices? How can I pass on this additional cost if I'm competing with the big retailers? So I'm kind of in this middle place right now that's really uncomfortable. And then we'll start getting into the seasonal goods, whether it's spring and summer fashion or the all-important year-end holidays.
Part of the goal of these tariffs, as you know, is to stoke domestic production. That takes time. What, in your view, would be the downstream impacts potentially for the port if that domestic production does come back?
If it does, you probably flip the entire conversation to an export-driven economy. That takes a little bit of planning from an infrastructure standpoint, lining up key participants in the supply chain, all of which can be done with a little bit of runway. But even if there was a decision to put a factory in the U.S. right now today, as we're talking, probably takes about 5 years.
Yeah.
And if it does open its doors, it's probably automated with robotics and very few workers. So this is something that we have to look at as a country, as an economy, and as a trading nation with a great deal of thought, and not necessarily just speed at which we get to frameworks of negotiations.
Lastly, before we go, is there a solution?
Yeah, I think it's building coalitions and trying to make sure that policymakers, both elected and appointed officials, understand the ground truth of what's happening. And there may be some good things that come out of this. If American exports can grow, I'm all for it. Protection of American jobs, even better. But we know that 90% of trade moves on water, and that's why it's so important to this port and city of Los Angeles.
Gene Seroka, Executive Director, Port of Los Angeles, thanks for coming in and bringing this into focus for us.
Great to see you both.
Thank you.